Can we bring clarity, consistency, and transparency to payer coverage decisions? I will now turn it over to our moderator, NPC Chief Science Officer, Dr. Bobby DuBois, for a few housekeeping items and introductions. Bobby?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and probably not good evening to anybody, but thank you for joining us for this webinar. This is a webinar that is probably 3 or 4 years coming. It's a project that started a number of years ago and has finally come to fruition with an article that recently came out in publication. And so now we want to get a chance for you to hear from the various authors of the article and those involved with the project to understand what we learned when we attempted to bring clarity, consistency, and transparency to payer coverage decisions. People often feel that it's a bit of a black box. A dossier goes in, it gets reviewed by a payer, and what comes out is some decision regarding tiering or coverage issues or medical management oversight, and what happens in the middle. And so we attempted to look carefully at what does happen in the middle. We did a lot of work, there was a lot of lessons to be learned, and we want to share some of those lessons with you today. So there were some acknowledgments I'd like to make. The initial phase that you will hear about, we had folks who at the time were at Pfizer, Newell McElwee, Kim McGuigan, and Liz Masters, were actively involved. We had an expert panel as part of our process for developing this approach. And you can see those folks listed here, and they range from folks in the academic environment and folks that were very much involved in formulary activities. And as well, we pilot tested this approach in 3 different P&T committee settings, as you will hear about, and those groups are listed here. And we have one of the authors, or one of the folks who's in charge of that at Horizon Blue Cross and Blue Shield, Sarah Jan, and she's going to give us her perspective as part of this hour. So these are the introductions, and then we will begin to hear about how was this tool developed, how was it piloted, and what did we learn about? And we'll be hearing about it initially from Dr. Jen Graff from the National Pharmaceutical Council. She's the director of CER. Then we'll hear from 2 folks at Cerner Research, Dr. Bonnie Dean, who's the principal investigator there and was involved in this project from start to finish, and Dr. Kelly Coe, who has also been involved throughout, and he's a research scientist. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to get the payer perspective, and not just any payer and any perspective, but actually somebody who was involved in testing the tool out, and I think they had some very insightful views of how this might be useful for some and perhaps not useful for others. And then we'll give you a chance for Q&A, as we always do in our webinars. And now you get to see the photo of all these people. So that's this slide. I am going to turn it now over to Jen Graff to talk with us about how the study came about and what the goals were for it when we began.
Thanks, Bobby. I'd like to talk through, give a little bit of background about why NPC was interested in this project. As many of you are involved and interested in, there's a lot of focus around the quality of and improving the quality of medical care. Well, David Eddy once wrote that the quality of medical care is determined by 2 factors. The quality of the decision that determines what actions are taken, and then how those decisions are actually executed. Now, over the past few years with the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, we focused a lot around how health care is executed. There's been far less focus on how decision-making is actually improved. So if we want to figure out how to improve decision-making, we have to understand the components that fit into decision-making. And probably just like most of our daily decisions, there's usually evidence that's part of the process, and then we make value judgments to arrive at our final decision. Well, the same holds true for formulary decision-making. There's evidence that's submitted from the manufacturers to payers, and it's gathered, analyzed, and synthesized. There are scientific judgments that are made based upon the benefits and risks compared to the alternatives. But rarely is that sufficient, so there has to be some preference judgments. And these preference judgments may include how important is that endpoint. And these value judgments may actually vary from individual to individual or from organization to organization. So just thinking about this as an example, one organization may value patient functioning, where another organization may actually value hard endpoints such as survival or readmissions. What's important to understand is how that decision is made. So if we think about how is this evolving today, what we see is that on the left-hand side, there's been a lot of progress in terms of determining what evidence should be submitted. There's the AMCP format for formulary submissions that outlines what information should be included in the format to submit this information. On the far right side, there's increasing availability on the internet and through other sources about what the formulary actual decisions and policy coverage determinations are. In fact, even some P&T committees actually report their summary of their meeting minutes and include what was decided, what the tier and formulary coverage may be. As Bobby alluded to, what happens in the middle is a bit of a black box. For instance, we don't quite know in all circumstances how the evidence is actually synthesized and analyzed. In one organization, it may be limited to randomized controlled trials. And in other organizations, it may expand to real-world evidence. And what the value judgments are that are made, how cost fits in, the importance of the endpoint, how many patients are covered, aren't yet clear to those that are involved or external to the process. So you may ask, well, why does this matter? Well, for patients that are going to be facing open enrollment in the next coming months, and they're evaluating multiple plans, they want to understand what is covered today for the conditions that they have, and what might be covered that they may need in the next couple of months. For employers and unions, understanding the decision-making process helps to understand how benefits will be administered. And for those in the biopharmaceutical industry, it's important to understand what evidence is required so we can reduce uncertainty and include that in our drug development programs. So in sum, the unexplained variability can be disconcerting to a number of people, and we sought to try to improve this process. So what would ideal look like? Well, the ideal framework or decision-making process might have a clearer framework. And to this, we have three characteristics. There would be clarity, there would be consistency, and there would be transparency. Let me describe a little bit about what each of these would entail. By improving clarity, we would know what factors are influential. This would allow all the stakeholders in the healthcare process to understand what goes into the decision-making process and to clarify where value judgments and preferences differ. If we seek to improve consistency, we'd understand where comparable scenarios are handled and how the same decision may be made in January would then be made in September at different points in time and potentially with different members of a P&T committee. And by improving transparency, we would ensure that those that are involved, and perhaps even those external, understand what was decided and the rationale why. All in all, we would think that this would help enable patients to make the decisions as they determine how to obtain their health care. It would help employers and unions. It would help providers understand what decisions are made, and it would help those in the biopharmaceutical industry determine what to include in their drug development program. So to try to improve the clarity, the consistency, and transparency, NPC, along with our colleagues at Cerner and with initial seed funding from Pfizer, undertook a process to try to develop and test a more structured format for making decisions. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Bonnie Dean to walk through the process that we used.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to now take some time to walk through the development of our evidence evaluation tool and its evaluation. You can find that the full text manuscript that I'm going to talk about today was recently published in the August issue of Pharmacy and Therapeutics. So this research project sought to develop and test a structured approach to making decisions regarding formulary access. Our hypothesis was that the approach might increase clarity, consistency, and transparency in the formulary decision-making process. And the study consisted of 3 phases. There was a phase 1 expert panel, and there was a survey of formulary decision makers, and our last phase was the pilot testing of the tool in the real-world P&T committee. We began the development of the structured approach by convening an expert panel. We had 10 advisors representing diverse backgrounds, all with expertise in formulary management, that were brought together to identify key factors in formulary decision-making and to determine how these factors, such as the quality of the evidence or the magnitude of the benefit or risk, are considered when formulary decisions are made. We used a modified Delphi approach to gather information and structure our discussion, and we used a series of hypothetical clinical scenarios. So these scenarios were developed for the pilot testing, and the expert panel rated these hypothetical scenarios. So what they would do is, for example, they would rate a scenario that looked at the magnitude of efficacy benefit for metastatic breast cancer, where we would vary the efficacy looking at a 4-month overall survival compared to perhaps a 1-month overall survival. In another scenario, we would look at the cost of the agent under different varying cost conditions. What we found was that the ratings of access varied greatly between the scenarios, and that it wasn't just one factor that was influencing access decisions. We found that the influence was dependent on the context and all the factors fitting together. And we also found, most importantly, that the level of evidence that supported the factors really mattered to the expert panel. So based upon coming out of the expert panel discussion, we developed an evidence assessment framework and then tested it in a larger sample of decision makers. The final factors that came out of the framework included safety, efficacy, cost, and certainty of the evidence. So what we did was we tested variations of these factors. For example, for safety, we looked at questions like, does the drug have similar, more, or fewer safety concerns than other agents currently on the market? For efficacy, we would look at questions like, is there a similar or increased level of efficacy when compared to other drugs currently on the market? We compared cost to similar agents to see if it was comparable, moderately higher, or markedly higher, and the influence of that cost. And we looked at the certainty of the evidence, so that knowing the magnitude of the efficacy benefit or the safety or the cost difference would be helpful, but we wanted to know what the quality of the evidence was. So again, with our survey, we used hypothetical scenarios to make these factors more tangible. And we applied them to hypothetical drugs in 4 clinical areas: hypertension, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's disease, and breast cancer. And within these scenarios, each of the factors that we have here on the slide were varied, such as low versus high cost of the drug. We explored each scenario based on different levels of evidence certainty, such as medium evidence certainty or high efficacy certainty. And we evaluated low, medium, and high safety. What happens when we combine all of these variables is we get about 192 unique scenarios. So let's take a deeper look into what it means to have a survey respondent rate their level of access. So what we did was we asked each survey respondent to rate each scenario on a scale of 1 to 9. about what level of access they would provide given the conditions of safety, efficacy, cost, and certainty laid out in the scenario. So a rating of 1 would represent that the rater would provide no access to the hypothetical drug in the scenario. They would not put the drug on formulary. Alternatively, on the other end of the scale, a 9 represents open access to a hypothetical drug. Open access might mean that it is placed on Tier 1 or is available with a generic copay. So now that we've outlined the individual factors and the scale, let's take a look at a couple example scenarios from the actual survey. Okay, so the first step is to identify the clinical scenario features. In this example, the clinical scenario is moderate hypertension, and the condition is an antihypertensive medication. Each of the factors on the left column represents varied safety concerns, efficacy, benefit, and cost. The blue, green, and yellow cells across the slide indicate the certainty of the safety and the efficacy evidence. So on this slide, we show 2 scenarios, one at the top, one at the bottom, where the certainty of efficacy evidence is medium. In the actual survey that the respondents received, they also saw additional columns where the certainty of the evidence was also high. And then lastly, within each of the cells, you can see the scale for 1 to 9, where the respondent would complete their likelihood of formulary access. So now let's kind of put it all together, and I can describe what these 2 example scenarios are. So here, respondents are asked to evaluate a new drug for patients with moderately severe hypertension. On the top, we have a scenario that pertains to a new antihypertensive drug. It has no safety concerns in similar agents. The drug is associated with 8 millimeters of mercury reduction in systolic blood pressure compared to an available branded agent, such as Diavin. But it is twice the cost. The second scenario, which you see on the bottom, pertains to the same drug. However, in this instance, we know that similar agents have known allergic reactions, and there is now only a 2 millimeter of mercury reduction in systolic blood pressure compared with an available brand agent, although it also comes at a higher cost. So again, when all the permutations of the factors are considered across our 4 hypothetical clinical areas, we have 192 combinations or scenarios that look similar to these. So to test the validity of the tool, we recruited a group of decision makers to complete the survey. And in order to reduce the burden on the respondents, we used a balanced incomplete block design so that the respondents didn't need to complete all 192 scenarios. They each received just a subset of those scenarios. We sought to recruit 84 individuals, and we sampled to achieve 2 pharmacy directors for every 1 medical director. Those who were qualified received a paper survey in the mail that asked them to rate these scenarios for likelihood of formulary access. And participants who returned completed surveys received a $150 gift card for their participation. Overall, 79 of the recruited participants submitted completed ratings across all the 4 hypothetical disease areas. And of those, 23 were medical directors and 56 were pharmacy directors. When we add up the possible scenarios across the 84 individuals, there are just over 4,000 possible scenarios. So those 79 individuals that completed the survey provided 94% of all possible scenarios that were used in our analysis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what our survey respondents looked like. At the bottom left, we can see participants represented organizations with a wide coverage at the national, regional, state, and local focus. On the bottom right, we can see that among those who participated, most were decision makers in a managed care organization, followed by pharmacy benefit management and hospital P&T committees. And lastly, on the top right, we can see that most of the organizations offered multiple lines of business, with 84% including commercial plans, 71% including Medicare, and about half including Medicaid. Here we report average ratings across respondents. So our scale rated access of formulary from 1 to 9, keeping in mind that higher ratings correspond to more access. Although not here on the slide, overall we saw a lot of individual variation across the ratings. There was a wide range of responses, indicating that they were willing to grant access in some circumstances, but not others. On the left of this slide, we have the average rating by user type. And we can see that ratings were lower for pharmacy directors compared with their medical director counterparts. On the right side are ratings by clinical condition. And after adjusting for efficacy, safety, cost, and the evidence certainty for safety and efficacy, the ratings differed by clinical condition. The greatest level of access was given to the new breast cancer drug, and ratings for the hypertensive drug were significantly lower than ratings for other drugs. So which factors contributed the most to the level of formulary access? To determine the effect of each of the factors, we used a mixed effects linear regression model using maximum likelihood fit with raters as the random effect. Lower formulary access was given in scenarios where there was a small magnitude of efficacy. You'll see that on the far left bar. When there was some safety concerns, the next set of bars, and when the cost was higher, the farthest right set of bars. Looking at the certainty of evidence, we found that formulary access was lower when there was less certainty of evidence for both efficacy and safety. All scenarios rated with a medium certainty of efficacy and safety evidence were rated lower than when there was a high certainty of evidence. Overall, our results supported that the usefulness of the structure and the clinical factors in the framework. And the results from the broad group of survey respondents were consistent with the expert panel findings and with the study hypotheses that we set out. Greater formulary access was associated with greater efficacy, lower costs, fewer safety concerns, and greater evidence certainty. So the question is, will this framework be beneficial outside of the hypothetical scenarios that we had set out? And would it be beneficial in the real-world pharmacy and therapeutic committee setting? So now I'm going to pass you over to Kelly Coe.
Great. Thank you very much, Bonnie. So I'm going to share with you some of the details about the third phase of this project, which was to pilot test this structured approach that was developed from the expert panel and through the survey research in a real-world P&T environment. So there were really three different parts to this process. So the first thing that we did is that we had recruited 4 different P&T committees, 2 of which that represented national health plans, 1 that represented a regional plan, and then 1 state plan, to pilot test the tool in one of their upcoming P&T formulary committee meetings. Now, in each of the 4 committees, we had identified one staff member who we worked closely with and really served as our champion. And this individual's job was to make sure that they facilitated use of the tool or the structured framework during the actual meeting, since we were not present for the actual committee meeting. And I do want to point out that each P&T committee did follow the same piloting process, which was to first evaluate the drug or the product using their standard process, and then reevaluate that same drug or product using the structured framework that we had proposed. So after we had recruited and identified 4 different committees, the second part of this piloting phase was then to allow each of the committees to reach a decision based on their standard processes. So they were asked to discuss and then reevaluate the same drug using the structured tool after they had already undergone their standard decision-making process. Now, I want to note here that the structured tool was pre-populated with the same evidence that had been used during their initial decision-making process. And we did this in collaboration with the site's designated staff member or the site's champion, who I should point out was also a voting member of the committee. And we did this by design because we wanted to make sure that any of the inputs or the information that was being considered during the decision-making process was exactly the same. So we didn't want to introduce any new information. We simply wanted to make sure that we presented that new information in a different structure or in a more structured manner. So after the committees had reevaluated the product using the structured tool, the last step in this process, in the piloting process, was to have each of the committee members complete a performance assessment. And this is where each member essentially completed a brief 10-item survey or evaluation. And the focus of this assessment was really to just gauge the ease of use, the clarity of the content that was presented, perceived benefits of using a structured tool, and then any other suggestions for improvement based on their experience seeing and then ultimately using the tool in their real-world P&T committee setting. So after we had collected evaluations from each of the committee members, we then also conducted a structured interview with the designated staff member after the committee meeting. And the goal of this was really to get a debrief and get a sense of how things went from the perspective of someone who was actually in the room to gain any additional qualitative insights to the group's experience using the structured tool or the structured framework. So now I'm going to share with you a bit about the committees that participated in the actual piloting or the implementation of the structured framework. So of the 4 recruited organizations, only 3 had completed the actual implementation. So only 3 ended up using the structured tool within the P&T committee meetings. But we still did maintain a nice mix of committees, one representing a national, a regional, and then also a state plan. So we were able to maintain a very diverse sample in that regard. Overall, a total of 40 different members across the 3 committees participated, not surprisingly largely comprised of physicians of various specialties and pharmacists. But we did have one plan that included an outcomes researcher who was a non-voting member, and then another committee that included a medical ethicist who was a voting member. So very diverse personnel in that regard as well. And then in terms of the actual products that were undergoing review, we also had a nice variety in this regard, as each organization reviewed a different product associated with different characteristics or circumstances. For example, one of the health plans was reviewing a specialty product that had few or no alternatives available. Another committee looked at a new oral product in a class with many other oral alternatives. And then one of the other plans was reviewing a new inhaled product in the context of other oral alternatives. So a lot of diversity in regards to the actual products being discussed as well. And then in addition to the actual products under review, we also saw a lot of variation in terms of the kinds of decisions that were being made. One committee was actually using the tool to review a prior formulary decision, so they were revisiting a past decision, while the other 2 committees were reviewing brand new products which had not yet previously been discussed or considered. So when you take all that together, although our sample size certainly was small, we only looked at 3 different P&T committees, they did represent and set the stage for a very diverse setting and a number of different circumstances. So now I want to talk a bit about what we found based on the committee's evaluation of the structured framework or the structured tool. And as you can tell by the data and the title of the slide, our results suggest that the structured tool was not received very well. In fact, on a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 representing an unfavorable response or not helpful, and 9 being a favorable response, we asked committee members to rate the utility of the tool across a number of different dimensions, some of which included whether or not they found it useful, did it increase or improve the discussions that took place during the actual meeting, do you think it would help increase consistency or transparency, if it helped to visualize the information. And when it was all said and done, it was pretty clear that committee members did not feel that it improved the decision-making process. And ultimately, when asked if you would recommend the tool, or if there were any other scenarios where you might view yourself using the tool, very few organizations could recommend it. So when you look at the evaluation data, certainly it doesn't look like it's a very favorable result. But we did also conduct a debrief or a structured interview with the site champion or the committee member who was actually in the room. And that was able to provide us with additional qualitative insights that helped really provide some context around why it may not have been received very well. So a couple of key characteristics that came up from all of the different committees was that, first, all of the organizations actually had fairly robust methodologies and robust processes that already helped them achieve clear, consistent, and transparent decision-making. So in this regard, they really didn't need or see the use of any additional tools. Another common thread was that the committee felt that the tool had oversimplified their decision-making process, so that it failed to account for additional details that they typically consider. Some of these things might include study designs, recommendations from professional guidelines, perspectives of local physicians or KOLs. So in other words, it did not account for the additional factors, many of which don't necessarily show up in an evidence table or a dossier, that seems to impact a product's review or the discussion that takes place during a formulary meeting. And related to this point, there was also concern that trying to establish a structured approach, such as the one that we did with this framework, may lead to the standardization of the decision-making process, which would ultimately limit the consideration of additional factors. So there was a fear that this might try and standardize how they think through a variety of different products. And so when we had asked the committee members about any suggestions for improvement, they did have a couple of interesting suggestions. One of which is that a structured tool such as this might be better suited for broader therapeutic class reviews or line extensions, where the process for decision-making and the evidence being evaluated may be a bit more straightforward. And in this instance, something like a visual matrix or a grid provided by the structured framework or the structured tool, could be viewed as useful. The committees also suggested that it might be better suited for evaluating evidence associated with the individual constructs as opposed to multiple constructs in one. So rather than evaluating efficacy, safety, cost, and certainty of evidence all on one particular matrix or one grid, perhaps you look at one of those domains, efficacy or just safety. And this is largely related to the fact that the sheer volume of information that seems to go into a lot of their discussion and the decision-making was far too much than could be accommodated by one particular grid or one structured tool. Another common thread, all committee members suggested, or all the committees suggested, that the tool might be better suited for smaller organizations that had smaller resources. And again, I think this points towards the fact that a lot of the committees that we had reached out to already had very robust processes in place. So smaller PBMs might be better suited to be able to use this structured process. And when it's all said and done, as Bonnie had alluded to, although our survey results suggest that there were some theoretical merits to establishing a more structured approach or a structured framework aimed at increasing clarity, consistency, and transparency, when you actually put this in play in a real-world P&T environment where real products are being reviewed, those merits were not being realized. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Graff, who I believe is going to provide us with a brief summary and wrap-up.
Thanks, Kelly. So as Kelly mentioned, we tried to take a step forward and think about a structured approach. We developed it, we tested it with a number of developers, and the theoretical merits seemed to indicate that there was increased clarity, consistency, and transparency. But in the real world, P&T decision makers perceived little value. So I think that this might actually be one of the cases of the quote, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they aren't. So if we come back to where we were at the beginning of our conversation, what you see is that there still is a bit of a black box between how the evidence comes in and how the evidence and decisions and policy are made at the end. And so we are still hopeful that some of the learnings that we had from this case study and through the discussion that we have today and through future conversations will help bring some of that clarity, consistency, and transparency to the system. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Saira Jan to discuss her perspective and activities that they have at Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. I would actually just like to bring out a couple of things, and one of the things that is critical is the fact that I think I would be very surprised if there are plans and PBMs that don't have a process in place. Most of the plans, most of the PBMs, and again, I don't differentiate P&T process outpatient versus inpatient. There are a lot of P&Ts that are conducted in hospital, and I think the focus over here was more of an ambiguity towards the managed care decision-making process. But and again, I can only speak for my organization, but being in managed care for so many years and talking to different directors of pharmacy and also looking at the PBM world, there is a process already in place. Where I think there is a gap is communication of that process to the consumers out there. But I think every P&T committee has a policy that they abide to that makes sure that there's clarity in making the decision, there's consistency, that you're making the same or you're looking at the same criteria over the period of time, and you're trying to be as consistent as possible to make the same level of the decision. And the transparency comes in when you communicate it to the pharmaceutical company or to the physicians out there. But I think what this really kind of brought to, I guess, it's much clearer for me, and looking at the members, that especially when we enter into the health exchange population, that we don't really communicate the process and we don't let people know what goes into the P&T process. Every P&T has a charter, and the things that are critical in a managed care organizations and the P&T process is to really understand the clinical efficacy, the safety. And what is different from a managed care perspective versus the hospital P&T is that in managed care and outpatient, you're actually also looking at the utilization, and that utilization then translates into the cost and the outcomes, if you can do that, and that goes into the decision-making process. Because repeatedly we see that the clinical endpoints that are seen and observed in a controlled, well-designed trial do not happen, or in the real-life scenario. I think the closest to a controlled trial is a hospital setting, where adherence is not an issue or the dose is not an issue. So those are the kind of things that are already taken into account in the P&T process. So, from our perspective, and I'm pretty sure other P&T perspectives, the tool that you created was actually not bringing anything in addition to the existing process. And we were very curious because we are always looking to refine the process. We are always looking at different things that can make the process more productive and effective. And the end result, was the same. The decision was the same, I would say, but the tool really did not capture all the moving parts that go into making a decision on a drug for a formulary status. But the key areas that the study or the tool focus, which is efficacy, safety, and cost, are critical in decision-making process. And the other additional thing is the utilization, which is tied into the cost. Cost, just looking at the acquisition cost or the pricing at the retail level, is not the cost. The cost is of the disease state. The cost is granted if it's once a day drug and you are moving it to twice a day, and the actual utilization is reflective of twice a day. Those are the things that are taken into account when you're calculating the final cost. And the P&T members look at both the clinical and the cost. And they literally are not going to compare a drug which gets into the market with just the same therapeutic class, but it could be cross-functional, going into different therapeutic classes or common indications. And that is critical in making a decision. And as we enter the era of healthcare reforms and exchanges and comparative effectiveness, where we need to have the most effective agent to offer to our members, these evaluation process are critical, but they are already there in place. I think what we need to do is maybe communicate that more effectively to the audience that is still not very clear as to how the decisions are made. But when you have the accreditation bodies like NCQA, when you have CMS, every organization has a P&T charter, P&T process, how a drug decision is made, just to ensure that there's consistency and just to ensure that there is clarity in how the decision is made. And the P&T process also, we have to understand that it has nothing to do in a lot of cases with the organization. Most of the P&T members have no conflict of interest. They are not employed by the organizations. And our process, because of that, is a very, a clean process where we even have representation of researchers and academic and practicing physicians and pharmacists, and making sure that all the legal requirements are met for the state and the national. So this tool, for at least our P&T process, did not offer, in fact, it did not cover a lot of things that we cover in making a drug decision. And then I think the other process is that how do we provide manufacturers the kind of information we are looking for. The manufacturer information could be one part of the information which is provided to them as what the expectations are through formulary submission guidelines, but that is one component. You're going to look at how the drug, if it's available in Europe, how the drug has been in Europe, what are the safety surveillance reports, what are the safety concerns at the FDA website, what are the guidelines, where is it placed in the guidelines, what is the physician experience in the real life scenario, and then actual utilization. And now more and more organizations are doing pharmacy and medical integration and looking at the short-term outcomes or anything that comes up. So all these things have to be taken into account when you are making a drug decision. But I think the organizations need to maybe provide this process details, I guess, to educate the consumers a lot more than we've been doing historically. But I think organizations like Managed Care and PBM, because they have a process in place and it is consistent, they may not have realized that there is this gap of outside individuals not understanding why a decision has been made, because one of the parts of the process is that you communicate that decision to the audience to say this is the decision and this is the reason why this decision is made.
Sarah,
I think
we have some questions that have come in that I think might be great now. Sure. One of which can be queued up for you, I think. And I think this is really a two-part question. Yes, there are processes in place at most PBMs and at most health plans that might say something like, we do a literature review, we look at all the evidence, we examine the safety endpoints, we examine efficacy issues, we look at relative costs, we look at practice guidelines, we find out how physicians are using it in the real world. So there may be documents that say we look at these 12 things. But what doesn't seem to be available is at the end of the day, we made the following decision regarding this drug, and not that, yes, we looked at evidence and da-da-da-da, but these were the 3 factors that were most important in our decision. The evidence still is unclear about the relative safety issues. The benefits don't appear to be that much more, but there are higher costs. So although the process is quite transparent, it isn't transparent what the factors were that drove the final decision and how important were each of those. So that's part 1. And part 2, as you mentioned, that clarity, consistency, and transparency already exist. Is there any evidence that that's the case, where similar drugs were tested in a blinded fashion, and yes, we did come up with similar decisions? And I would question the transparency issue, because what drove the decision does not seem to be transparent. So let me turn it over to you to address this set of questions that have come in from the webinar participants.
Okay, so I think if you are looking for the 3 areas that are the drivers of making a sound decision, they are efficacy, safety, and cost that you've highlighted. I mean, no, I don't think so. There's any P&T committee out there that doesn't take that into account. Now,
right, but when you made your choice about drug A, the question would be, how important was the safety signal? How important was the relative cost? It's not that you looked at safety, efficacy, and cost, but what drove the decision and how important was each factor. Because if at the end of the day you said it's a great drug, the price point was reasonable, but we have some uncertainties around this study, and therefore we couldn't, put it at tier 2, then industry could say, fine, I need to beef up that study so that you feel more comfortable. How do people understand the relative weight of that when you make a specific drug decision?
Okay, so that makes it much clearer. So what I would say to that is that efficacy and safety are very important. So if you were looking at a scale of 1 to 5, efficacy is critical, right? So the drug has to be efficacious. So if it's not an efficacious drug, you're not even talking about worth taking to P&T. So if efficacy is there, it is 5. Safety then comes into play, right? So if safety concerns are very high, then the efficacy weight is not relevant, because you may be killing people, and you will have to make sure that you have a certain in place in order to ensure that the right population gets that. So safety is very critical. You may have an efficacious drug based on the clinical trial, but you may want to monitor that utilization very closely, and the drug may still have a tier 2 position with a to make sure that the safety concerns are addressed. Cost comes in. The only time cost plays a heavy role is when you have a drug introduced into the market, and again, this is not a new concept, when they are similar in efficacy. So if you have drug A and drug B, and they have similar efficacy, similar safety concern, but the cost of one drug is higher than the other. So if you were a cash-paying customer, would you go and buy a more expensive drug for the same value? You will not. The same thing is, cost is just not the acquisition cost. So when the plans or PBMs look at the utilization, they're going to say, okay, you know what, this drug is for the same indication, same efficacy, same safety concern, but it is used once a day, and this other drug with the same profile is used twice a day. The acquisition cost may be the same, but because it is used twice a day, it's double the cost. So from that perspective, cost will play a role when everything else is equal. So when plans have it, they have it exactly the criteria to say, if this is what the scenario is, it goes in tier 1. If this is a scenario, it goes in tier 2, and they are most probably able to share that with everybody, where efficacy and safety go hand in hand. If a drug is very efficacious and it is killing people, you have a lot of concerns. You may not want to put it with no monitoring parameters. You want to put it, make sure that it is closely monitored with prior authorization or registry or whatever. So that is critical. Efficacy is the leading way, followed by the safety. So now can you just refresh me the second part of the question? I remembered it, but now I forgot.
Well, I think you've actually addressed both of them pretty much at the same time.
Okay.
Let me sort of ask a related question that's now come in. So October 1, consumers are going to have an opportunity to choose amongst different health plans as part of the exchanges. For others on the phone, any insights that you've gleaned from this research that might help consumers as they try to understand differences that might relate to formularies and how what gets on the formulary or doesn't get on the formulary or those types of choices? Any insights that you guys can make suggestions for?
Yeah, and Bobby, I think one thing that really came from the real-world implementation process is that the sheer volume of information that they are processing for each decision was far too much to be captured within the structured tool. But one suggestion that did come up, and I think it's quite a good one, is that consumers bear a bit more responsibility in terms of selecting plans and figuring out, where can I get the products that are important to me and at what cost. Tools such as this that are too simplified for a formulary committee might be spot on for a consumer. So, it really taps into this idea that evidence evaluation isn't something that's necessarily now exclusive to providers and formulary committees, but as consumers themselves have to do a bit more of their homework. A tool like this might be something that is helpful in trying to determine how much more am I willing to pay or perhaps not pay, knowing that there are alternative treatments or products that are fairly similar and have very similar safety profiles, and we know that there's a lot of body of work supporting that. So I think something like this is really helping target the consumer as an evaluator of evidence themselves as well.
Jen, any thoughts that you have you would like to add? One of the issues that relates is, where does the evidence fit in or the strength of the evidence fit in? That was one of the key factors that seemed to be very influential. How might P&T groups go about synthesizing evidence, especially when we're now moving to a world that there's not only RCT data, but also real-world evidence?
Thanks, Bobby. Well, so this first crack at this didn't solve the equation, but there is some work that's ongoing. NPC and its members are involved in a collaboration with Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, AMCP, and ISPOR, the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research. And they're working to really try to provide tools that are practical, easy to use, and scientifically robust to help evaluate individual studies with a focus on observational studies where there's a lot less focus than really the typical review that includes randomized controlled trials. The second part of this, once they evaluate individual studies, we actually did a very systematic review around how can you synthesize all of this information that may come from randomized controlled trials, observational studies, models. How do you put that all together? And with payers, and this was key, we've had several key payers involved in this, and we tested it at a focus group. So they've been much more involved along the way to try to understand how the magnitude of the benefit and the certainty of the benefit can come forward. And so we'll be rolling out tools in the next couple of months, including one called the ICER Evidence-Based Medicine Rating Matrix that helps identify the strength of evidence. And so while this isn't going to solve the whole problem, it may definitely help that first box. What is actually included in the evidence synthesis? So stay tuned.
Well, stay tuned, I think, is the proper parting words, because we have reached the end of our hour. I want to thank Kelly Coe, Bonnie Dean, Sarah Jan, and Jen Graff for continuing this dialogue, and it is our hope that the questions that arose as part of this research, and I think we had more questions than answers, that type of dialogue can continue and that we work towards a more transparent environment so everybody understands how decisions are made. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your joining us on future webinars.